It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking to, I think, a group of people who are kind of like-minded in terms of where their sets of concerns are in the field of research training, and to kind of give you a sense of how we're approaching this at the University of Toronto. So what we're going to talk about today is an initiative that we've actually been working on for a couple of years now, and that we're still developing in the process of beginning to roll it out. So it is a kind of continually iterative process, and that's one of the things that we'll be discussing in the presentation. So we're going to focus kind of on two parts of this program in the course of the discussion. One is kind of the process that we went through to develop the program and kind of the governance structure associated with it, and how it's organized, and some of the learnings we had coming out of that process. And I'll sort of take that section, and then Lynn is going to pick up and really just kind of outline for you what the Healthy Labs program is looking like at this stage, in terms of how it's going to be structured. So Lynn, could you let me just tell you what you're looking at here before we get started. So you're looking at the University of Toronto, which has 3 campuses. The middle picture is the downtown campus, which I'll show you in a minute, is where the concentration, the greatest concentration of research activities takes place. And then on the right-hand side, you have the University of Toronto Scarborough, which is in the eastern part of the Greater Toronto area, and on the left you have the University of Toronto Mississauga, which is in the western part of the city. And these are the 3 campuses that constitute the U of T. The largest is downtown, but the 2 other campuses are also middle-sized institutions in their own right, which also have large concentrations of researchers. And the overall entity of U of T at the graduate level is a unified enterprise. And so in my role as dean, we have sort of oversight and provide support to all those researchers. First slide, please. So to get us started, I want to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, which you saw there in those pictures. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Next slide. So let me just give you a little more detail about the University of Toronto. As I mentioned, it has 3 campuses. And then we have 7 colleges, which are sort of undergraduate communities associated with those campuses. We have 9 fully affiliated hospitals. So the downtown campus in particular is located adjacent to quite a number of research hospitals, with whom many of our faculty are working, and so many of our researchers are actually located in the hospital settings. We have $1.4 billion of annual research funding, 15,000 plus faculty, and the majority of those are in tenure stream, which means research-based appointments. 9,900 staff members, lots of librarians, sessional, 1,000 plus sessional lectures, which, if you look in comparison to many other North American universities, especially in the US, we actually have lower numbers of those kinds of, sort of contract lecturers, and more fully appointed. And then we have 1,500, a little more than 1,500 postdoctoral fellows and 21,000 graduate students. So I think that's another area where we're perhaps distinct from European universities, just in those proportions. We have a lot of students who are located as students, and although our postdoc numbers are growing, they're perhaps not as sizable as at many European institutions. Roughly half of those 21,000 grad students are in professional programs, which are not explicitly research focused, and the other half are in either master's or PhD programs. And then we have at our institution 10 unions and 25 bargaining units. And that's just important for us to recognize, because as we start to talk about the lab environment, I think it's also important to recognize that the lab environment at the University of Toronto is also a labor environment with different constituencies represented coming from different unions or student groups. Next slide, please. This just gives us a sense of how the geography plays out across the three campuses. On the left-hand side, you can sort of see that the downtown campus is really represents more than half of all the students at U of T, and the vast majority of graduate students. But we are seeing growing numbers at University of Toronto Mississauga and University of Toronto Scarborough in the graduate domain, as we're building more and more labs out there, which are based they're more based in specific research areas. And then on the right-hand side, you can just sort of see the breakdown in domestic and international students, and roughly 20% of our graduate students are international. Next slide, please. So let me just talk a little bit about the impetus for the initiative and its governance. So really this initiative is its aim is to meet a bundle of objectives. So it's not a kind of single objective here. And as the name Healthy Labs and Research Teams indicates, it's more about a culture shift, but there's different kind of goals that are elements in that culture shift. So one of them is to foster what we here at U of T refer to as inclusive excellence, which is a focus on academic excellence that recognizes the importance of inclusivity of racial and cultural diversity to achieving that kind of research excellence. And so there's a real focus on access and equitable inclusion. It's also aiming to elevate research innovation and integrity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. A big part of it has come to focus on enhancing training and supervision and mentorship. And it's one of the vehicles we're using to do so. There's another vehicle which is kind of adjacent to the Healthy Labs initiative that I'll also discuss briefly. And it is part of our effort to respond to rising mental health and wellness concerns, particularly in our graduate student population. And then also thinking about where graduate students land in terms of their careers. We've done a lot of research on this in regards to our own outcomes for our grad students and particularly our PhD students, and our postdoc fellows. And we're recognizing that, it's in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%, depending on the discipline, or sometimes as high as 40% of our PhDs, for example, will land in a tenure track job. But we're still looking at, roughly 1 in 5 who will not, that they'll usually end up in a research position of some sort, but it may well be in the private sector or in government, or in a different kind of research institute. And so we want to make sure that the skills that we're providing are in line with those sorts of outcomes, at least generally. And then also we're trying to make sure that what we're doing here dovetails with best practices in Canadian government research funding agencies, the national agencies that provide research funding for social sciences, life sciences, and physical sciences, and with their priorities. Next slide, please. In terms of kind of where we position this initiative with respect to both supports and quality assurance, we see it as a bit of a missing link in a way. So we recognize that research lab and team environments are a key pillar of a healthy training culture. And we already have in place regular reviews of all of our graduate programs through the University of Toronto quality assurance process. So programs, graduate programs are being reviewed, and that's quite a rigorous process. We also have support for the dyadic relationships that exist between supervisors and students. And that's in a relatively new center we've created called the Center for Graduate Mentorship and Supervision. And part of the impetus for the creation of that center actually came out of discussions about healthy labs and through a consultation process we went through. But we also recognize that there's a kind of unique research environment that's not really captured in program reviews. And it's also not fully captured in the dyadic relationship between supervisor and student, or supervisor and postdoc, which is the research setting and that can be understood both kind of socio-spatially or in terms of just the sociological aspect of working in a team, in a group environment. And we see that some of the challenges around creating a healthy environment are not always focused on the dyad. They're also focused on the team culture. So our aim here really is to take a proactive approach to fostering healthy research environments through a focus on labs and teams. Next slide, please. There's also kind of a more concrete impetus for this initiative that I think it's important to acknowledge, which is that up until a certain point at the university, we were dealing with challenges that arose in labs essentially after the fact, after conflicts had emerged or research integrity challenges had been identified through our various processes for doing so, which are often quasi-judicial processes. So for example, our Office of Research Integrity that sits with the Office of Vice President, Research and Innovation, would note that many of the cases of research integrity that they were dealing with in that office actually seemed to stem from broader cultural concerns. You might have instances of bullying and so on, and that has an impact on the quality of the science that's coming out. And then likewise, from the standpoint of the School of Graduate Studies, we were dealing with cases where we might get complaints about quality of supervision or various kinds of complaints that end up in equity offices and so on. And when we look at the cases, we would find that in fact it wasn't just like a single case. There was a series of different cases in the environment, in the setting, and the setting was the lab. And so it wasn't enough to just be tackling the individual cases, and we felt like it was a bit of a rearguard action. And the ombudsperson for the university came up with an explicit recommendation that we focus on developing a more proactive and positive focus to shift the culture, so that rather than taking we have our punitive approach where it's actually required, But what we want to do is really celebrate celebrate the work, the good work that most of our community is engaged in, and to really elevate that as a value. That was, yes, so there was a, just responding to Michelle McGinn's question in the chat. It was a quote from a governing council report from the ombudsperson. So the ombudsperson reports to governing council annually and makes recommendations, and these recommendations were accepted by the university, and part of the response to that recommendation was the development of the Healthy Labs Initiative. Next slide, please. And sorry, if you go back, the second quote, I'm realizing she was asking about the second quote. No, that was a separate report related to research integrity matters. So this helps to explain, though, that it was coming out of two places. On the one hand, it was coming from research oversight. And then on the other hand, it was essentially coming out of oversight related to student experience. Next slide. So our initial step was to commission a report focused on the lab environment, for which we had Reinhard Reitmeyer, a very seasoned faculty member and research and lab scientist, and then a PhD student, someone who was then a PhD student, Sarah Williams, now graduated, who did a whole bunch of consultations across the university and co-authored a report that included 20 recommendations focused on providing more training and the creation of an internal award system. And a good number of those recommendations also focused on matters of supervision. And so as we developed the Center for Graduate Mentorship and Supervision, many of the priorities that were identified in that report are actually being addressed through that initiative. And then I would also just point out that, you know, for other reasons, there was a presidential and provostial task force on student mental health, which had a recommendation in it to really shift the culture of the university away from a continual focus on pure academic excellence to also creating a more caring community particularly for students in order to support them in their studies and ensure the academic excellence that we desire. And so the Healthy Labs is very much seen as consistent with the objectives laid out in that task force. Next slide. So it has been a collaboration between the School of Graduate Studies and the Office of Vice President, Research and Innovation in terms of the development of the program. And there you see some of the people who have been involved in kind of spearheading the initiative. Next slide, please. The basic structure for the program is that we have a steering committee, which is, consists of academic and administrative leaders from across all of our faculties, pretty much, or virtually all of them. It's a large group, but it ensures that we have all the divisions where research teams and research labs are based, that they have a voice in the process, and they're on board with the way we're moving, and also that other types of leadership, like academic human resources, are also involved, because there are some areas where the Healthy Labs Initiative sort of bumps up against issues around, faculty's working relationship with the university. We also have a program Programming Implementation Committee, which really includes experts from other centers across our campus, which offer initiatives of a similar kind, where elements in their educational programming are likely to benefit the healthy labs, and where coordination is necessary. And then most importantly, we're constituting an advisory council, which includes basically members, researchers from across the community, faculty, postdocs, graduate students, staff, to review the program plan, to evolve it over time, and to be part of a learning community, a kind of community of practice of people who really take an interest in this area, much like the network here, but on our campus. And this is how we're going to ensure that there's kind of sufficient kind of bottom-up shaping taking place in our institutional structure. Next slide, please. So this has been a fairly laborious process, frankly, in terms of the consultations that we've engaged in, even post the production of the report from Professor Reitmeyer. We've presented it widely across our campuses to a lot of different stakeholder groups. We've held numerous focus groups on the initiative. And then we've engaged the members of the Program Implementation Committee, which you can see includes quite a number of different what we describe as central services at the university, including, from the Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Center, the Learning and Leadership Center, which is for staff, the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, and then the Center for Teaching Support and Innovation. So these are existing services that offer workshops and supports, and mediation and those sorts of things. And we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is also plugging our researcher community into those supports. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk briefly before handing it over to Lynn to describe the program itself about what some of the key kind of decision points and learnings that we've had through all those consultation processes. And so first of all, just to highlight again, that we really have, from the outset, tried to frame this as being an upstream, proactive, and celebratory program, rather than a punitive one. And I say that it sounds perhaps obvious, and it's easy to say, but as you go along in the process, I have found it's one of those things we need to keep coming back to. Because there is a common tendency that can emerge is to focus on negatives, on problems, and so one has to kind of continually come back to the fact that, look, we're trying to bring culture shift, and it's not going to be a short-term process. It's going to be a long-term process. A big issue in our context with our highly decentralized structure is balancing grassroots momentum with top-down oversight. Like, where do you find that balance? And I think to some extent, what we've found is there's been a kind of swinging back and forth to some extent, which has been productive. And it ends up being kind of a dialectical process. And what we keep hearing is, it's really important to tap into the grassroots momentum, because there really is a desire for this change, and it's often driven by more junior faculty members who have an interest in this, as well as certain key senior faculty members, and so making sure that we're tapping into that energy while also ensuring that whatever happens is happening within a structure that makes sense from an institutional perspective as well. The real need for sensitivity to disciplinary differences, which relates to kind of research teams that exist in the humanities all the way into the physical sciences and life sciences, and the different models of training. So really allowing for the cultural differences that exist across our institution to be represented where appropriate. And a big part of that is focusing on language, the language that one uses, so just as an example, calling it healthy labs, calling it research teams, calling it research groups. These are conversations we had many hours of conversation about. And, can humanities people see themselves in labs, in the word labs, and that sort of thing. And then of course, it's not just the labels, but it's all the language one's using to describe it is really important. And our key point has always been, we're not trying to serve everyone with this, because the dyadic relationship is not a major focus, and not every humanities researcher will see themselves in this program. But where there are research teams active, we want them to be able to see themselves in this program, and so our language is designed for that purpose. And while we recognize that the supervisor sets the tone and models leadership, we also want to recognize that it is the whole team that's involved in fostering a healthy environment. So it's not putting all the onus on the supervisor, but the supervisor is an important leader, and we do expect them to model the positive behaviors. And then sort of within this, within the group, we want to focus our education at different career stages and different job roles within the team. And that's both, for the benefit of the education and also just a pragmatic, we can't do everything all at once. So we're planning to really, as we roll out the education, we're planning to start with early career stage, for example. And then also really recognizing the diverse contributions of different members of the team, lab assistants, as well as postdocs, as well as grad students, visiting scholars, and so on. And part of that is about balancing their preferences. We did focus groups with all the different groups, and we have to balance out what their needs are. And then a real complexity for our particular environment is navigating institutional partnerships, because as I said, a lot of our grad students are located in hospitals. That's where their lab is, and so the human resources is handled over on that side of the fence, and we don't have visibility on it whatsoever. And so that's one where we've run up against it, but we haven't yet fully addressed it yet. So now I'll just hand it over to Lynn, who will kind of give you an overview of the program itself.
Thank you. So I think I'll pick up on this thread of that Joshua has talked a little bit about already, where the goal in the program content is that we want to create and foster an environment where people feel like this is something they can continue to work toward and continue to learn about, and that this is really about celebrating healthy research practices in the same way that we're very used to celebrating outstanding research outputs and teaching accomplishments. And so when we think about our program and how it's going to develop, we have some really great models at U of T already. So we've seen a shift in the past couple of decades in how people value and prioritize teaching of undergraduates and graduate students. And so over the past 20 years, advances in teaching innovation and the scholarship of pedagogy has really become a priority. And there's this wonderful Center for Teaching Support and Innovation, a CTSI at U of T, which is really a hub now for faculty members and other trainees to support, how do we implement good practice? What are your teaching goals? How can we help you achieve that? And so that has, that's been a long process and really productive. And so we're trying to follow that path and really embed healthy research practices and healthy research teams as another aspect that we support people to work toward. So I think we've touched on this a little bit about the definition of like a healthy lab or a healthy research team or a research group. And it's quite important and it's quite a change for me. I've been working in medical sciences and sort of clinical science for a long time, but that is not how all of our research teams look. So, the pictures on this page are designed to give you an idea that across our entire institution and 3 campuses and all of the different faculties that we have, research looks very different. And so we've focused this initiative on groups, so at least 3 people, and some of them will be much larger than that. Some will be smaller. They will involve a variety of people in different roles, students, postdocs, staff, faculty, but their actual research looks very different. And not every educational relationship between supervisors and their trainees, even if there are multiple trainees, is going to be set up as a lab or team, and that's okay. This doesn't, we don't have to address everything all at once, but our aim is really to develop programming that's complementary to the supports that already exist for other things. So as Joshua mentioned, we have the Center for Graduate Mentorship and Supervision, which is very focused on pairs of supervisors and students, or supervisors and postdocs, and fostering those relationships positively and correcting things when they've gone wrong. And so we are really focused on labs or teams, but that is going to look very different across our different disciplines and across groups of different sizes. So when we think then about what makes one of these teams or groups or labs healthy, that is actually also quite challenging when we're sitting in the middle of the institution trying to think about things that will apply to this wide range of different scenarios. And so, in terms of being prescriptive about what people should be doing day to day and how to operationalize things, we have to be careful there and respect all of the different norms that exist in different programs and different modes of inquiry. Also thinking about the fact that these labs and teams are dynamic. So you might start with a lab that's 3 or 4 people and grow to something that has 30 people in it. And what works really well for you when you had a small team might not work so well now that your team has grown, or a key person might leave, and that might really shift the dynamics. And so we are trying to develop content that takes into account the dynamic nature of these groups, the very different research cultures, plural, that exist in our departments, and also that people have different styles. There's more than one way to be a good supervisor. There's more than one way to run a healthy lab. And so we have steered away from trying to prescribe what people should be doing every day with their team and think about more general principles and supporting people to do things in a variety of ways. So our program has 3 components. There's an educational component where we're trying to make sure people are aware of what we think are promising practices and tools that are available, templates, resources, supports that people can access to enhance the culture in their own group. We're also developing a recognition program to celebrate achievements in this area. So again, putting the same amount of recognition and celebration into having healthy practices in your team as we do for producing a really great paper or developing a really great class or curriculum. And then seed funding. So we've talked a little bit about the balance between bottom up and top down. And we know that we have some really talented and bright and clever people doing very interesting things all over the place. And we want to hear about them and support them to develop those further. So this is the seed fund is about supporting some of those projects that might be going on a smaller scale with our platform at the, across the institution. So all of those pieces of this program are organized around a framework of 7 facets or 7 themes or skill areas that we think are quite important if you're going to have a healthy research environment. And for each of those 7 areas, we've identified what we're calling promising practices. So it's a little bit tricky to try and say what a best practice is. A lot of it, there's a lot of literature on research culture. Most of it is in the biomedical area, and there is a lot of gray literature as well. So rather than empirically tested methods or interventions, there are a lot of things that have worked well somewhere, or descriptions of things that people believe to be best practices. And so we've tried to talk about promising practices, and again, that also respects that they may work really well in one context and not in another, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And so we're developing a library of resources and educational programming around those 7 facets. So we've got leadership, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, group collaboration, professional development, research, innovation, and integrity, supervision and mentorship, and well-being. And we really see these areas being implemented through an inclusive leadership style by the lab leader. So again, recognizing that leader has an important role to play. I won't read through all of this text, but just to give you a bit of an idea about how we've described these different facets. But I want to draw your attention also to the word aspirational on this slide, because, and I think I saw a comment in the chat about putting pressure on faculty members. So what we don't want to contribute to more metricization or, more pressure on faculty that they have another thing to do, another thing to stay on top of. We're aware that people have highly pressured time and a lot of things to work on, but we do want people to work towards these things as well. And so we hope that, even if people feel like maybe they're not quite there yet, or there's an area that needs improvement, that's okay, that it's the process and the work of and engaging in the work of moving towards these goals is really important in itself. And so for each of those facets, as I mentioned, we've identified some promising practices. And while some of them are quite general and probably apply even if you don't have a team, so they might apply in dyadic situations as well, the suitability for them does vary a little bit depending on what kind of research people are doing and who is in their team. But we think that even if a particular practice isn't something that people feel like fits really well for their situation, that even discussing it with their team is actually a really useful exercise, and thinking through why it would work or wouldn't work can really help people think about their expectations and make sure that they've had that discussion with their team. So these are just a couple of examples for 2 of the facets: group collaboration and professional development. So we can see, like, if we take the example under professional development of co-creating an individual development plan or IDP, or career development plan with each trainee and updating that annually, I think that's something that most people can probably implement. But the form that will take will look quite different depending on the topic area and the mode of inquiry, the template that people might want to use, the range of career paths that people might be considering, the specific development needs and skills that a trainee needs to acquire will look quite different. And so in thinking through our educational programming and the resources that we would provide, we need to make sure that we are able to support people to implement a practice like that in a variety of different ways. So the educational programming component of the Healthy Labs and Research Teams initiative that we're working on now is a set of sessions or modules, one for each facet. And these are going to be quite workshop based. So we're keen that when faculty, and initially these are targeted, as Joshua said, at sort of early career faculty, so pre-tenure. that they get something really useful out of it. So we're designing these to be quite interactive and to have practical outputs that people can walk away with at the end of the session. So whether that's a template or whether they're workshopping something within the session that they can then take back to their team and use, we're trying to make sure that these educational components are really useful for people, because that is one of the ways that we will be encouraging uptake and participation, is that this isn't just, again, this isn't about being punitive, it's about education and celebration, right? And making sure that this is actually useful to everybody, rather than saying that this is something you must do. And so we're hoping that we can also develop these sessions into some kind of curriculum with formal recognition for people for doing the work. So if you are taking part in all of this and taking the time to work on these different things, and you work through this whole curriculum, there may be a certificate or other kind of notation at the end, so that people can include that when they're going to apply for tenure or apply for promotion, as evidence that they, again, are really focused on having healthy research practices in addition to being productive in their research and teaching activities. And again, I think we've talked a little bit about being complementary to all of the amazing resources. So in that list of people who we've consulted about this project, you will have seen people focused on sexual violence prevention, anti-racism, accessibility for people with disabilities, mental health, wellness. So there is a lot of other programming going on, and what we're really focusing on is, again, the situation of a lab or another research team, rather than sort of general purpose information. The recognition program that we have in development, again, we, rather than sort of putting out an award for the best of the best, what we're really focusing on here is recognizing people's contributions and really surfacing good practice. So going through the process of nominating somebody and reviewing these applications will also be a way for us to identify people who are doing really interesting things in this area, making outstanding contributions across the different facets. And then again, putting that work on equal footing with research accomplishments, innovation, commercialization, or other professional accomplishments. And so we are going to have awards for outstanding contributions, and also develop a healthy labs and research teams charter, so a commitment that people can use to kind of badge themselves as thinking that this is important, and as recognizing that healthy research environments are really important in graduate and postdoctoral training environments. And then the seed funds, again, this is also another way to kind of highlight good practice. So identifying promising initiatives that are taking place in our different faculties, divisions, departments, or individual labs, and supporting them to further develop those, to accelerate the impact. So that might mean that somebody takes something they've developed in their own lab and brings it to a wider audience, or translates it to a different discipline, and to help local initiatives that are already successful maybe scale for a wider audience. So again, with our 3 campuses, our 9 hospitals, and our really devolved and autonomous programs, we want to hear what they're doing and what's working well, and make sure that everyone knows what everybody else is doing, because in an institution this size, that can sometimes be challenging. And in a central position like we have, this is one of the ways that we can really platform some of those nice ideas that are working well. So I think it's at this point that I'm going to invite Joshua to rejoin me to kind of give a summary and close out. But that's the basic description of what we have in development now. And hopefully 2023 will be our year when we launch all of these amazing things.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Yeah, so just to kind of reiterate, this is a program that was really developed for our particular context, and there may well be learnings that others can have, but it's really evolved to its and adapted to its environment, and we kind of expect it to continue to do so. And the really important thing, I think, is striking that balance between bottom up and top down, and to continually focus on the celebratory, and just to recognize, and this is something, as an administrator who is appointed for 5-year terms and that sort of thing, is to recognize that culture change takes real time. It's not worth rushing. You're not trying to achieve something in a year. When I look at the teaching culture at this university, when I started, in the early 2000s working here, all the focus was on our research excellence, and the Center for Teaching Support and Innovation, it took them years and years of programming and awards and all sorts of things to move the needle to now teaching really is a part of our culture that's respected. We recognize our great teachers. It's part of our promotion processes. It's part of how we assess people for progress through the ranks. And that's a 10-year, 15-year timeline. And I think realistically speaking, our goal here is also on that kind of a timeline. It's not going to be something that's quick, but it's also about building a community within the institution to bring that and to kind of spearhead that culture change and to have that, people's involvement in that continually cycling through. So we'll just leave it there, and happy to take any questions or provide any comments.